An ordinary apartment building, a closed door, and behind it, a faint, chemical odor hangs in the air. His neighbors knew him as shy, quiet, and someone who kept to himself. Sometimes they heard the sound of a drill, sometimes strange smells emanated from his home, but no one could have ever imagined that behind that door, a museum of horror that pushed the boundaries of human sanity was being assembled. This is the story of a man who saw his victims as objects, who took their lives so they could never leave him, who experimented with unimaginable methods to dominate their bodies, and who finally resorted to cannibalism to literally make them a part of him. Jeffrey Dahmer was much more than a serial killer. He was the living embodiment of one of the modern era's most disturbing questions. Do the greatest monstrosities blossom within the most silent and solitary of souls? Prepare now to open that apartment door and take a journey into the darkest, most primitive corners of the human psyche. Jeffrey Dahmer's story, in stark contrast to his blood-curdling crimes, begins within the astonishingly ordinary tableau of an American suburb. Born in May 1960 in Wisconsin, Jeffrey was, from the outside, the first child of a normal family. His father, Lionel, was a research chemist, his mother, Joyce, a homemaker. But within the walls of this normal family, storms were raging that would inflict deep wounds upon a young boy's soul. From the very beginning, Lionel and Joyce's marriage was a toxic battleground. Constant, vicious arguments became the daily routine of the household. Joyce, struggling with her own mental health issues, was a hypochondriac who constantly invented illnesses to gain attention and was emotionally distant and often bedridden. Lionel, in turn, was focused on his academic career, attempting to isolate himself from the emotional chaos at home. An often absent father, Jeffrey was trapped between these two poles, an invisible child. He was completely deprived of the love, attention, and secure environment he desperately needed. In his parents' unending war, he was merely a spectator, and often a forgotten detail. This profound emotional neglect formed the bedrock of Jeffrey's character. He grew into an introverted, excruciatingly shy, and socially inept child. He struggled to communicate with other children, preferring to be alone rather than join their games. This solitude became both a sanctuary for him and a fertile field where dangerous fantasies would grow. He experienced one of his first major traumas at the tender age of 4 when he underwent surgery for a double hernia. Years later, he would tell his father that after this surgery, something changed, that he never felt the same again. This may have been etched into his mind as an invasion of his body and privacy, triggering a lifelong fear of losing control. The most distinct and disturbing obsession of his childhood was a pathological interest in death and dead animals. While other children played with balls, Jeffrey searched the woods and roadsides for roadkill, crushed, decaying animal carcasses. He brought these carcasses home, examining them with a curiosity that his father, with his chemistry background, mistakenly encouraged as scientific interest. Lionel saw his son's fascination as that of a budding scientist, teaching him how to clean animal bones and assemble skeletons. However, Jeffrey's interest was fed by something far darker than science. He was obsessed with knowing what was inside a dead body. This was his first experience of the absolute control and power he could exert over a lifeless form. An animal carcass could not fight back, could not judge him, and most importantly, could not abandon him. This was a primitive rehearsal for what he would later do to his human victims. As he cut and dissected animals, examining their internal organs, he was actually nurturing the fantasy of dominating the most secret parts of a living being. This hobby became a compensation for his social incompetence and emotional void in the outside world. In the mind of this quiet and harmless-looking boy, a monster that reduced living things to mere objects and fueled a desire to possess them was slowly taking shape. The chaos and neglect of his family was nothing less than the toxic soil that nourished this monster. Jeffrey Dahmer's adolescent years were a period when the internal chaos and loneliness that began in his childhood deepened, setting him on an irreversible path. The hallways of high school were a social hell for him. His pre-existing shyness and social anxiety became unbearable during this time. He simply did not know how to communicate with his peers or how to make friends. This sense of ostracism pushed him towards strange and attention-seeking behaviors. He took on the role of the class clown at school, suddenly collapsing to the floor, pretending to have epileptic seizures or mimicking the movements of someone with cerebral palsy. This was, in reality, a pain-filled cry for help. The attention he could not gain through normal means. He tried to obtain through shocking and disturbing actions. Doing a Dahmer became a slang term at his school to describe these bizarre fits. But these jokes were a tragic testament to how deeply lonely and desperate he was. The most destructive element to enter his life during this period was alcohol. He began drinking secretly at the young age of 14, and alcohol quickly became his only refuge, his only friend. Alcohol suppressed his social anxiety and, for a fleeting moment, eased his internal tension. He would come to school with liquor, in a thermos or hidden in his pocket, drinking between classes, and sometimes even during them. His alcoholism would become a catalyst, further severing his already tenuous connection to reality and providing the courage necessary to commit his future crimes. The sexual awakening that comes with adolescence was another source of fear and shame for Dahmer. As he began to discover his own homosexual identity, he viewed these urges as deviant and dirty. Under the pressure of society and his family, he tried to suppress these feelings. But these suppressed sexual fantasies grew progressively darker and more violent in his mind. The male figures he was sexually attracted to also became objects of his desire to control, possess, and dominate. His fantasies were shaped less around a romantic relationship and more around the idea of having a non-resistant partner who would never leave him. It was at this point that his necrophiliac fantasies began to sprout. In his mind, he constructed scenarios where a drugged, unconscious, or dead body was completely under his control, where he could do anything he wanted to it. These fantasies were a pathological defense mechanism he developed against his greatest fear, the fear of abandonment. If his partner were dead, they could never leave him. His high school graduation was further proof of how disconnected he had become. He attended the ceremony heavily intoxicated. He couldn't even stay sober for a major milestone in his life. He later confessed that during this period, he had his first concrete violent fantasy of knocking out a male jogger with a baseball bat and abducting him. He didn't act on this thought, but the dangerous line in his mind was about to be crossed. The final blow that accelerated this process was his parents' divorce and his mother leaving home with his younger brother. When his father also moved out to a hotel shortly after, 18-year-old Jeffrey was left all alone in the large, empty house of his childhood, with nothing but his alcoholism and his dark fantasies. Loneliness was no longer just a condition for him, it had become an armor that enveloped his entire being. And inside this armor, the monster, fueled by the false courage provided by alcohol, was preparing to emerge from the darkness to find its first victim. The summer of 1978 is the turning point in the life of Jeffrey Dahmer. It is the moment when the dark fantasies he had been cultivating in his mind for years transformed into cold, brutal reality. Having just turned 18 and graduated from high school, he was left completely alone in the family home following his parents' separation. This environment of absolute freedom and lack of supervision was the perfect incubator for the monster within. There was no one left to stop him, no one to question his behavior. His loneliness and severe alcoholism were pushing him down an irrevocable path. On that fateful day, June 18, 1978, while driving aimlessly, Jeffrey saw a young man hitchhiking on the side of the road. This person was 18-year-old Stephen Hicks, trying to get home from a rock concert. Hicks had no idea when he got into Jeffrey's car that he was on his final journey. Jeffrey invited Hicks to his house to have a few beers and listen to music. The invitation seemed perfectly innocent and ordinary. The two young men spent hours at Dahmer's home, talking, drinking, and listening to records. But as time went on, Hicks wanted to leave. This was the precise moment that triggered Dahmer's greatest fear: abandonment. Hicks's desire to leave pushed the panic button in Dahmer's mind. He did not want to lose him, did not want to end the companionship he had established, however brief. This fear of abandonment instantly morphed into a pathological desire for control. To prevent Hicks from leaving, he approached him from behind and struck him twice in the head with the bar of a 10-pound dumbbell. Hicks lost consciousness and collapsed. After a moment of panic, Dahmer realized he wasn't dead, and this time, he strangled him. That was the moment Jeffrey Dahmer became a murderer. Years of fantasy had become a bloody reality. In the aftermath of the murder, he was in a state of panic, unsure of what to do. He hid Hicks's lifeless body in the crawl space under the house. For a few days, he tried to carry on with his life as normal, but the presence and eventually the smell of the corpse constantly reminded him of his crime. He decided he needed to regain control. This control meant doing to a human body what he had done to animal carcasses in his childhood. He moved Hicks's body to the bathroom, and there, he dismembered it. For him, this was both an effort to destroy evidence and an act of total domination over his victim's body. He separated the flesh from the bones, tried to dissolve the bones with acid, and buried the remains in the woods. This horrific process was the first and most brutal application of his fantasies of necrophilia and dismemberment. Following this first murder, Dahmer briefly attempted to lead a normal life. At his father's insistence, he enrolled in college, but lasted only a few months. He then enlisted in the army, stationed in Germany as a medical specialist, but was discharged due to his ever-worsening alcoholism. He could not hold on to any aspect of a structured life. He could not conform to any framework required by society. The only reality in his mind was now shaped around control, possession, and death. The murder of Stephen Hicks was not an end for him, but a beginning. With this act, he had discovered the most effective way to prevent people from leaving him was to kill them. This terrifying discovery would form the foundation for the series of murders he would commit in the following years. The thin veil between fantasy and reality had been torn forever by the blood of Stephen Hicks. Between Jeffrey Dahmer's first and second murders lies a long and quiet gap of 9 years. These lost years are of critical importance for understanding his criminal profile. This period was not one in which the monster within him slept. On the contrary, it was a process in which he lay in wait, becoming more organized, more controlled, and more audacious. After being discharged from the army, Jeffrey, with nowhere else to go, was sent by his father to his grandmother's house. In West Allis, Wisconsin, Catherine Dahmer was the only family member who treated her grandson with love and affection, offering him a home. This environment of relative stability allowed Jeffrey to refrain from acts of violence for a time, but this was merely the calm before the storm. While his life at his grandmother's house appeared calm on the surface, the storm in Jeffrey's inner world continued to rage. His alcoholism worsened, and he spent his days shut in his room, cultivating dark fantasies. During this period, his offenses were on a smaller scale but were still disturbing. He was arrested several times for indecent exposure at public places like the Wisconsin State Fair. This was another manifestation of his desire for distension and his attempt to release his sexual tension. One of the strangest incidents of these years was his relationship with a male mannequin he stole from a department store. He brought this mannequin home, talked to it, slept with it, and used it in his sexual fantasies. The mannequin was the perfect partner for him, lifeless, obedient, and it would never leave him. This was a symbolic rehearsal for what he would later do to his victims, a reflection of his desire to turn them into inanimate objects. After a 9-year hiatus, in 1987, he could no longer suppress his urges. He committed his second murder, that of Stephen Twomey, whom he met at a hotel bar. Dahmer claimed he was in an alcoholic blackout that night and woke up in his hotel room to find Twomey dead beside him. Although he said he couldn't remember exactly what happened, this event marked the moment he crossed the killing threshold once again. He stuffed Twomey's body into a large suitcase, brought it to his grandmother's house, and hid it in the basement. This was the beginning of a new phase in his criminal career. He was no longer leaving his victims behind. He was bringing them home to possess them. His grandmother's house unwittingly became his hunting ground. He began bringing young men he met at gay bars in Milwaukee to the house with promises of money and alcohol. James Dockstader, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Sears. The list grew. He would typically drug his victims with sleeping pills and then strangle them. Catherine Dahmer remained completely unaware of the horrific murders her grandson was committing in her basement. She sometimes grew suspicious of the sounds or strange smells, but she could never imagine her grandson was capable of such monstrosity. Jeffrey exploited his grandmother's trust to the fullest. His post-mortem rituals also evolved in this house. He took photographs of his victims, dismembered their bodies, and kept certain parts. His preservation of Anthony Sears's severed head and genitals in the basement for a time was a clear indicator of how deep his desire to collect trophies and permanently possess his victims had become. Eventually, due to his grandmother's increasing suspicions and the unsustainable situation at home, Jeffrey was forced to leave. He was now ready to move to his own place, to apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments, where he could establish his own kingdom and no one would disturb him. These lost years at his grandmother's house were, in fact, a dark training camp where a monster transformed into a full-fledged predator. When Jeffrey Dahmer moved into apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments, located at 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee, he entered the most prolific and horrifying period of his criminal career. This small, run-down apartment was much more than a home to him. It was a laboratory, a shrine, and a tomb that served as the final destination for his victims. This was his personal kingdom where he could bring his fantasies to life without any restrictions. A place where he had absolute control. The apartment of horrors became a physical manifestation of the darkness in Dahmer's mind. Dahmer's operandi became clear and routine during this period. He typically selected his victims from young men he met at gay bars or downtown. The majority were of African American, Asian, or Latino descent. This choice may have stemmed not only from his sexual preference, but also from a cold calculation that when individuals from these minority groups went missing, they would attract less attention from the police and the public. He usually approached his victims with promises of money for posing for photographs or for sharing a drink. His shy yet seemingly harmless demeanor made it easy for him to gain their trust. The most common method he used to control his victims once he got them to his apartment was to lace their drinks with sleeping pills, usually halcyon. Once the victim was unconscious, Dahmer had complete control over the defenseless body. At this point, he would commit sexual assault and then typically strangle them. However, Dahmer's ultimate obsession was to keep his victims alive, but in a completely submissive state. He had a fantasy of creating a zombie, a will-less being who would never leave him. To achieve this horrifying goal, he attempted to drill holes into his victims' skulls and inject hydrochloric acid or boiling water into their brains. All of these experiments ended in failure, causing the immediate death of his victims, but they are chilling proof of the lengths he would go to in his quest to create the perfect partner. Apartment 213 gradually turned into a house of death. Neighbors complained about the unbearable smell of decay and the constant sound of a drill coming from the apartment. Dahmer used copious amounts of deodorant and cleaning supplies to cover the stench, dismissing complaints with the lie that he was throwing out spoiled meat. The inside of the apartment resembled a horror movie set. There were severed human heads in the kitchen refrigerator, human hearts and other organs in the freezer. In a bedroom closet, he kept skeletons and mummified body parts of his victims. Most horrifically, there was a large, blue 57-gallon drum in the living room. He filled this drum with hydrochloric acid and used it to dissolve the flesh and tissues of his victims in an attempt to destroy the evidence. One of the most tragic and unforgivable incidents of this period is the story of 14-year-old Conarax. After Dahmer lured the boy to his apartment and drugged him, Conarax somehow managed to stumble out onto the street in a dazed state. Neighbors who saw him naked, bleeding, and incoherent called the police. However, when the officers arrived, they believed Dahmer's lie that "this is my 19-year-old lover, he's drunk and we had a fight." Without verifying the boy's age or condition, they handed him back to his killer. Shortly after the police left, Dahmer murdered Conarax. This incident was a tragic combination of police negligence, prejudice, and Dahmer's manipulative ability. The apartment of horrors was etched into criminal history not just as the lair of a killer, but as a monument to the blindness of society and its institutions. To understand the actions of Jeffrey Dahmer, one must go beyond the classic serial killer cliches and delve into the most disturbing depths of human psychology. His motivation was far more complex and layered than a simple desire to kill. The most powerful emotion underlying Dahmer's crimes was a pathological fear of abandonment. The profound loneliness and emotional neglect he felt since childhood prevented him from forming normal, healthy bonds with people. Whenever he got close to someone, he lived in terror that the person would eventually leave him. The pathological solution he developed to cope with this fear was to permanently possess his victims. By killing them, he eliminated the possibility of separation. A dead body could not leave him. This was the ultimate form of possession and control for him. His necrophilia stemmed from this same desire for possession. A living partner had their own will, thoughts, and the potential for rejection. A dead body, however, was completely passive and subject to Dahmer's fantasies. The sexual acts he performed with the corpses of his victims were less about sexual gratification and more a demonstration of power and dominance. His practice of taking Polaroid photographs of his victims served the same purpose. By reliving these moments over and over, he attempted to immortalize this moment of absolute control he had established. Cannibalism, one of the most shocking elements of Dahmer's profile, was the most primitive and symbolic pinnacle of this desire for possession. By eating parts of his victims, usually the heart, liver, or bicep muscle, he believed he was literally making them a part of his own being. This was not just a physical act, but a grotesque ritual, an attempt to absorb the victim's essence, their spirit, and merge with them forever. Through this act, the victim ceased to be an external entity and became a memory living within Dahmer's own body. Psychologists and psychiatrists have assigned various diagnoses to Dahmer, including schizotypal personality disorder characterized by odd beliefs, social isolation, borderline personality disorder marked by a fear of abandonment and unstable relationships, and a psychotic disorder. However, no single diagnosis is sufficient to explain the totality of his actions. Although Dahmer experienced moments of detachment from reality, he knew that his actions were wrong. He planned his crimes, attempted to destroy evidence, and took precautions to avoid capture. This indicates that he was not acting in the throes of a psychotic episode, but as a conscious and deliberate predator. Over time, Dahmer's actions also suggest he developed a kind of God complex. The power to decide who lived and who died made him feel omnipotent. He had a plan to build a sort of altar or shrine in his apartment, constructed from painted human skulls and skeletons. This was to be a place of power and reverence for him. In this kingdom of death he created, he was the sole ruler. His experiments to turn his victims into zombies are also a part of this God complex, a reflection of his desire to control life, to destroy will, and to create a new being in his own image. In conclusion, Dahmer's psychology is a lethal combination of profound loneliness, a pathological fear of abandonment, an absolute desire for possession and control, and the necrophilia, cannibalism, and godlike power fantasies that these feelings fueled. He was, in the truest sense of the word, a cannibal of the soul, consuming the lives and bodies of others to fill his own void. The night of July 22, 1991, was the night Jeffrey Dahmer's 13-year reign of terror came to an end. It all began, as it often did, with a routine hunt. Dahmer invited 3 men he met at a bar, including 32-year-old Tracy Edwards, to his apartment with the promise of money for posing for photos. After the other 2 men left, Edwards found himself alone with Dahmer. That night, Dahmer's behavior was more erratic and threatening than ever. He handcuffed Edwards, pressed a large butcher knife to his chest, and told him he was going to eat. His heart, the unbearable stench in the apartment, the vat of acid on the floor, the knife in Dahmer's hand, and the strange movie playing The Exorcist 3, made it clear to Tracy Edwards that he was facing the greatest danger of his life. After hours of psychological terror, Edwards created a momentary opportunity. When Dahmer was distracted, Edwards punched him with all his might, stunning him, and ran for the door. With a handcuff dangling from one wrist, he burst out of the Oxford apartments and managed to flag down 2 patrol officers on the street. In a panic, he explained that a freak had handcuffed him and was trying to kill him. The officers, Robert Roth and Rolf Mueller, initially thought it might be a simple domestic dispute, but due to Edwards's insistence and the handcuff on his wrist, they decided to check the situation. The police accompanied Edwards to the door of apartment 213. Jeffrey Dahmer, who answered the door, appeared extremely calm and cooperative. He claimed he didn't know where the key to the cuffs was. As Officer Roth moved toward the bedroom, he noticed a series of Polaroid photographs lying on the nightstand. These photos contained graphic images of dismembered human bodies, severed heads, and unimaginable scenes of Dahmer posing with his victims. In horror, Roth turned to his partner and shouted, "These are real." At that moment, it became clear. The apartment was a crime scene. Dahmer attempted to resist, but was quickly subdued and arrested by the officers. From that moment on, the secrets of the apartment of horrors began to spill out, one by one. When the crime scene investigation teams entered, the scene they encountered was enough to freeze the blood of even the most seasoned detectives. A fresh human head in the refrigerator, organs in the freezer, skeletons in the closet, and the dissolving human remains in the large blue drum. Every corner of the apartment was filled with the parts of more than a dozen victims. The discovery shocked not only Milwaukee but the entire world. What followed his arrest was almost as surprising as his crimes. In the interrogation room, Jeffrey Dahmer presented an extremely calm, cold, and cooperative profile. It was as if he was relieved of the burden of the secrets he had carried for years. He told the detectives about every single murder he had committed, down to the last detail. He calmly confessed where and how he killed each victim, what he did with their bodies, which parts he kept, and which ones he ate. These confessions lasted for hours and shattered the psyches of even the detectives involved. Dahmer seemed almost relieved to have been caught. He was aware that he could no longer live in the hell he had created. Tracy Edwards's brave escape that night not only saved his own life, but also the lives of Dahmer's potential future victims, and that desperate cry for help, carried onto the street by a single handcuff, closed the dark and bloody chapter of one of America's most horrific serial killers forever. Jeffrey Dahmer's trial was followed with intense public interest, rivaling that of his crimes themselves. The trial, which began in 1992, was broadcast live in America and around the world. The defense team, rather than denying that Dahmer committed the crimes, built a strategy based on the argument that he was mentally ill and could not be held legally responsible for his actions. According to the defense, Dahmer was a slave to uncontrollable urges like necrophilia and therefore lacked the capacity to distinguish right from wrong at the time of his crimes. This insanity defense became the centerpiece of the trial, turning the courtroom into a battleground for psychiatrists and experts. The prosecution, on the other hand, argued that Dahmer's actions were extremely planned and organized. His selection of victims, his methods of luring them, his clandestine commission of the murders, and the meticulous effort he put into destroying evidence, all proved that he was fully aware of what he was doing. The blue acid drum, his drugging of the victims, and the lies he told the police were presented as proof that he was not a mentally ill person, but a cunning and manipulative killer. The most poignant moments of the trial were the victim impact statements. The families, telling the stories of how their loved ones were lost, reminded everyone in the courtroom that this case was not just a psychological analysis, but an irreparable human tragedy. The testimony from the family of Tony Hughes, a deaf victim, left deep scars on the conscience of the public. Ultimately, the jury rejected the defense's insanity plea and found Jeffrey Dahmer guilty on all 15 counts of murder for which he was tried. He was sentenced to life in prison for each murder, totaling a sentence of over 900 years. As Wisconsin did not have the death penalty, this was the most severe punishment he could receive. Dahmer was sent to the high-security Columbia Correctional Institution to serve his sentence. His life in prison was a reflection of his fame on the outside. He was both seen as a celebrity by some inmates and hated for the nature of his crimes by others. Dahmer generally maintained a quiet and compliant demeanor in prison. He even turned to religion at one point and was baptized. However, this reformed image could not quell the hatred that would lead to his end. On November 28, 1994, while cleaning the prison gym, he was beaten to death with an iron bar by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver. Scarver would later claim he killed Dahmer because Dahmer taunted other inmates by fashioning his food into the shape of severed limbs, and because he believed he was acting on God's command. Jeffrey Dahmer's life, which began in violence, had ended in it. Dahmer's legacy is more than just a bloody crime file. His case posed uncomfortable questions to American society and its justice system. The catastrophic negligence of the police, especially in the case of Konarak Synthosemphone, exposed how institutional prejudice and homophobia could lead to tragedy. The fact that most of his victims were from ethnic minorities became a painful mirror reflecting how little the voices of marginalized individuals are heard by society. Jeffrey Dahmer was not just a product of his own mind, but also a reflection of a society that ignored him, neglected him, and allowed the monster within him to grow. He remains in history as an unforgettable warning of what kind of darkness can be hidden behind the most ordinary-looking doors. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer is a journey into the deepest abyss of the human soul. When he was caught, he seemed almost relieved. So, what do you think? Despite all the risks, why didn't this man stop sooner or seek help? Was the real force pushing him to his next victim, the void inside him, or was it pure evil? Share your thoughts and theories with us in the comments. For more in-depth criminal analysis like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Your support gives us the strength to shed light on these dark stories.